On September 4th, 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer walked into the palace of Ravenna and deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor. The boy emperor was 15 years old. He had ruled for less than a year. His own name was a cruel joke, Little Augustus, mocking the memory of Rome's first and greatest emperor. With that single act, the Roman Empire that had dominated the world for over 1,000 years ceased to exist. But Rome didn't fall in a day. It died over centuries through a sequence of decisions so predictable, so consistent, that historians can map each stage with mathematical precision. The empire that once commanded 3 continents and 40 million subjects destroyed itself through policies that seemed logical at the time, but proved fatal in combination. The most terrifying aspect of Rome's collapse isn't how it happened. It's how closely modern America follows the identical pattern.
Walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum today, and you'll see broken columns where senators once debated the fate of nations. The marble steps that echoed with the footsteps of emperors now host tourists taking selfies. What was once the center of the civilized world became archaeological curiosities that children study in history books. But the ruins don't tell the real story. The real story lies in the decisions Roman leaders made when they faced the same challenges that confront American leaders today. Unpayable debts, military overextension, currency debasement, social decay, and foreign competition. Rome's responses to these challenges created a template that every failing empire has followed since. The template predicts not just how empires die, but when and why the death becomes inevitable. America is following that template with disturbing accuracy. The beginning of the end, 235 to 284 AD. Rome's terminal decline began during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire faced what historians call the perfect storm. Military pressure from barbarian tribes, economic collapse from currency debasement, political instability from civil wars, and social fragmentation from loss of shared values. Sound familiar? Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had 50 emperors. Most died violently. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. Political stability became impossible when every military commander could claim imperial authority, and every regional crisis could trigger empire-wide civil war. But the political chaos was a symptom, not a cause. The real problem was economic. Rome could no longer afford to maintain the military forces necessary to defend an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The mathematics were brutal. Roman legions cost approximately 250 denarii per soldier per year. With roughly 400,000 soldiers deployed across the frontiers, military expenses alone consumed 100 million denarii annually. Total imperial revenue from all sources barely exceeded 120 million denarii. When 85% of government income goes to military spending, there's nothing left for infrastructure, administration, or economic development. The empire became a giant military force that existed solely to defend itself, producing nothing and consuming everything. American military spending follows identical mathematics. The Pentagon consumes over $850 billion annually, while total federal revenue approximates $4 trillion. When interest payments on debt are included, mandatory spending exceeds total income before accounting for any domestic programs or infrastructure investment. Like Rome, America has become a military empire that exists primarily to defend military commitments rather than to produce economic value for its citizens. The debasement solution, 250 to 350 AD. Faced with expenses that exceeded revenue, Roman emperors discovered the same solution that every failing government finds: debase the currency, and pay bills with worthless money while hoping nobody notices the fraud. Emperor Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius from 98% to 83%. His successors kept cutting. By 250 AD, Roman coins contained barely 5% silver. By 350 AD, Roman currency was primarily bronze with silver plating that wore off within months of minting. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman soldiers were paid in coins that merchants rejected. Roman citizens watched their savings evaporate as prices exploded. Roman trade partners demanded payment in gold or goods rather than accepting worthless Roman currency. But the economic impact was worse than the psychological damage. When money becomes worthless, economic calculation becomes impossible. Businesses can't plan investments when costs and revenues change unpredictably. Workers can't negotiate wages when the purchasing power of payment fluctuates daily. Governments can't collect taxes when the currency used for payment has no stable value. Commerce collapsed. Cities emptied as residents fled to the countryside where barter was possible. The complex supply chains that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries broke down when participants couldn't establish fair exchange rates for depreciating currency. America's currency debasement follows the identical pattern with modern technology. The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply by over 400% since 2000, while claiming this expansion supports economic growth rather than government financing. But the results mirror Rome's experience. Savings lose purchasing power. Investment planning becomes speculation on monetary policy. International trade partners seek alternatives to dollar settlement. The complex financial relationships that sustain modern civilization become increasingly unstable as currency manipulation distorts price signals. The barbarian solution, 350 to 450 AD. As Roman military capacity declined and economic resources dwindled, emperors made a decision that seemed logical but proved catastrophic. They hired barbarian tribes to defend Roman territories against other barbarian tribes. The policy appeared brilliant. Germanic warriors were cheaper than Roman legions. Tribal leaders were eager for Roman gold and official recognition. Barbarian allies knew local terrain and enemy tactics better than Roman commanders stationed thousands of miles from home. But employing barbarians to defend the empire created dependencies that eventually destroyed Roman sovereignty. Germanic tribes learned Roman military techniques while maintaining their own tribal loyalties. Barbarian generals gained Roman political authority while pursuing Germanic interests. Foreign soldiers received Roman citizenship and legal protections while remaining culturally and politically separate from Roman society. By 400 AD, the Roman army consisted primarily of Germanic tribes led by Germanic commanders pursuing Germanic objectives with Roman financing. The empire that had once conquered Germania now depended on Germanic protection for survival. America follows identical logic, with nearly identical results. American corporations have outsourced manufacturing to China while expecting Chinese cooperation with American strategic objectives. American universities train Chinese scientists and engineers who return to compete with American companies using American-developed technologies. American military strategy depends on allies who pursue their own interests while receiving American financing and protection. NATO expansion has created obligations to defend countries that contribute minimal resources while expecting maximum American commitment. Most significantly, American economic growth depends on immigration from countries whose cultural and political values differ dramatically from traditional American principles. Like Rome's barbarian allies, these new Americans receive citizenship and legal protections while maintaining separate cultural identities and political loyalties. The division disaster. 285 to 395 AD. Emperor Diocletian's reforms in 285 AD represented Rome's last serious attempt to solve systemic problems through administrative reorganization, rather than addressing underlying economic causes. Diocletian divided the empire into western and eastern sections, each with separate emperors, separate armies, separate administrative systems, and separate economic policies. The theory was that smaller, more manageable territories would be easier to defend and govern effectively, but division created new problems while failing to solve existing ones. The Western and Eastern empires competed for the same resources while facing the same barbarian pressures. Administrative duplication increased costs while reducing efficiency. Political rivalry between emperors undermined coordination against common threats. Most damaging, division destroyed the psychological unity that had sustained Roman identity for centuries. Citizens began identifying as Western or Eastern Romans, rather than simply Romans. Regional interests took precedence over imperial interests. The shared values and common purpose that had enabled Roman expansion and maintenance disappeared. America faces identical pressures toward political division. Regional differences in economic interests, cultural values, and political priorities have created effectively separate countries operating under the same constitutional framework. Blue states and red states pursue contradictory policies on taxation, regulation, immigration, and social issues. State governments openly defy federal policies they oppose, while demanding federal resources for programs they support. Political leaders gain popularity by attacking other regions, rather than solving national problems. Like Diocletian's reforms, American political division creates administrative duplication and inefficiency, while failing to address the underlying fiscal and economic problems that drive regional tensions. The final century, 376 to 476 AD. Rome's collapse accelerated during its final century through a cascade of crises that overwhelmed the empire's capacity for response. Each individual crisis might have been manageable, but their combination created systemic failure. The Visigothic invasion of 376 AD began when Germanic tribes fleeing Hun expansion requested permission to settle within Roman territory. Emperor Valens agreed, believing that Gothic warriors would strengthen Roman defenses, while Gothic taxpayers would increase Roman revenue. Instead, the Goths rebelled within 2 years. Roman forces sent to suppress the rebellion were destroyed at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where Emperor Valens himself was killed, along with 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army. The military disaster triggered political chaos. Multiple claimants seized imperial authority. Regional commanders declared independence. Barbarian allies switched sides based on opportunities for plunder rather than loyalty to Rome. But the political and military crises were accelerated by economic collapse. Roman taxation had become so oppressive that citizens welcomed barbarian rule as preferable to Roman government. Roman currency had become so worthless that trade occurred through barter or foreign currencies. The Western Roman Empire's final emperors were children or puppets controlled by Germanic generals who ruled in their own interests while maintaining the fiction of Roman authority. Real power had transferred to barbarian commanders who no longer needed Roman legitimacy to control Roman territories. America's final century may have begun with the 2008 financial crisis that revealed systemic problems American institutions cannot solve through traditional political or economic approaches. Like Rome's Gothic crisis, 2008 seemed manageable initially, but created cascading failures that continue accelerating. American cities are becoming ungovernable as crime, homelessness, and economic decay overwhelm municipal resources. American institutions are losing legitimacy as they prove incapable of addressing obvious problems. American military commitments exceed American capacity to fulfill them effectively. Most ominously, American political authority increasingly depends on cooperation from foreign powers and domestic interest groups whose loyalty cannot be guaranteed during serious crises. The lessons Rome ignored. Roman historians and philosophers understood exactly what was destroying their empire. Tacitus warned about currency debasement. Cicero criticized military overextension. Augustine described social decay. Diocletian attempted administrative reforms, but understanding the problems and implementing solutions are different challenges. Roman political institutions had become incapable of making decisions that imposed short-term costs for long-term benefits. Democratic assemblies wanted immediate benefits. Military commanders demanded resources for expansion. Regional administrators sought autonomy from central control. Every proposed solution required sacrifices that some powerful constituency refused to accept. Fiscal responsibility meant reducing military spending that generals opposed. Military consolidation meant abandoning territories that local populations defended. Administrative efficiency meant eliminating jobs that government workers protected. Rome's political system had evolved to distribute benefits while avoiding costs. When the external resources that funded this arrangement disappeared, the system collapsed because it had lost the capacity for self-correction. American political institutions face identical constraints. Neither political party can propose realistic solutions to fiscal problems because realistic solutions require sacrifices that important voting blocs refuse to accept. Military spending cannot be reduced significantly because defense contractors, military communities, and international allies oppose consolidation. Social spending cannot be reduced significantly because beneficiaries, government workers, and advocacy groups oppose cuts. Tax increases cannot be implemented significantly because taxpayers, businesses, and competing jurisdictions oppose higher rates. Like Rome, America has created a political system that distributes benefits while avoiding costs. The system depends on external resources, foreign lending, reserve currency privileges, military dominance, that are disappearing as international conditions change. The psychological collapse. Rome's final decades featured the same psychological phenomena that characterize declining civilizations: nostalgia for imaginary golden ages, cynicism about institutional effectiveness, retreat into private concerns rather than public engagement, and acceptance of decline as inevitable rather than correctable. Roman literature from the 4th and 5th centuries focuses on private virtue rather than public achievement. Roman education emphasized classical texts rather than contemporary challenges. Roman religion turned toward personal salvation rather than civic responsibility. The psychological withdrawal from public life accelerated institutional decay as the most capable citizens focused on private survival rather than public service. Why sacrifice for institutions that couldn't protect the civilization they claimed to represent? American culture exhibits identical characteristics. Political engagement has declined as institutions prove incapable of addressing basic problems. Educational achievement has stagnated as curricula focus on historical grievances rather than future capabilities. Religious participation has decreased, while spiritual seeking has increased. The psychological preconditions for civilizational collapse are forming as capable citizens conclude that institutional reform is impossible and personal preparation for decline is more realistic than public efforts at restoration. The barbarian transformation. Rome didn't disappear overnight. Roman institutions, Roman law, Roman engineering, and Roman culture persisted for centuries after 476 AD. But they persisted under Germanic control, and for Germanic purposes rather than Roman ones. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, and the Franks in Gaul all maintained Roman administrative systems while pursuing tribal objectives. Roman cities survived under barbarian rule. Roman roads carried barbarian armies. Roman laws protected barbarian interests. But the civilization that had created these institutions was gone. The shared values, common purposes, and collective identity that had sustained Roman expansion and maintenance had transferred to Germanic tribes who used Roman tools for non-Roman goals. America faces similar transformation rather than sudden collapse. American institutions, American technology, American infrastructure, and American culture will likely persist long after American political authority disappears. But they will serve Chinese interests, Islamic purposes, or corporate objectives rather than American ones. The question isn't whether American civilization will end. All civilizations end. The question is, what will replace it, and whether the transition will preserve any of the values and achievements that made American civilization worth preserving. The mathematical inevitability. Rome fell because Roman solutions to Roman problems created more problems than they solved. Currency debasement worsened inflation. Military expansion increased costs. Administrative complexity reduced efficiency. Social benefits created dependencies. Each individual policy seemed rational when implemented, but the cumulative effect was systemic breakdown. The empire became too expensive to maintain, too complex to govern effectively, and too divided internally to respond coherently to external challenges. Mathematical limits govern all civilizations, regardless of their cultural achievements or technological capabilities. When maintenance costs exceed productive capacity, decline becomes inevitable. When political institutions cannot make necessary adjustments, collapse becomes unavoidable. America faces the same mathematical constraints that destroyed Rome. Military commitments exceed economic capacity to support them. Government obligations exceed realistic tax revenue. Social divisions prevent collective action necessary for institutional reform. The outcome is predetermined by fiscal and demographic mathematics that cannot be overcome through political rhetoric or technological innovation. Understanding Roman history doesn't prevent American collapse. It only explains why the collapse follows predictable patterns, regardless of the specific personalities or events that provide immediate triggers. The final parallel. Romulus Augustulus was 15 years old when Germanic chieftains deposed him in 476 AD. He had inherited an empire that existed only on paper. His authority extended no further than his palace guards could march. His treasury was empty. His army was commanded by barbarians who owed him no loyalty. The boy emperor's deposition was almost an afterthought. Real power had transferred to Germanic generals years earlier. Roman authority had become a ceremonial fiction, maintained for administrative convenience rather than political necessity. America may be approaching its own Romulus Augustulus moment, the point where formal authority becomes irrelevant because real power has transferred to forces beyond institutional control. Corporate interests, foreign governments, and demographic changes are reshaping American society regardless of electoral outcomes or constitutional provisions. When that moment arrives, the end will come quietly, almost anticlimactically. Like Rome's final emperor, America's final leaders will preside over institutions that exist primarily as historical artifacts rather than effective governing mechanisms. The parallels are complete. The pattern is clear. The mathematics are inevitable. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with mathematical precision. And Rome's final days echo louder with each passing year.